They never wrote it down. Not on parchment. Not in runes carved deep enough to survive fire and salt. Because some knowledge was never meant to be preserved by ink. It was meant to be remembered, whispered from breath to breath, hand to hand, river to river. Long before the world learned to measure sharpness in angles and machines, before sparks flew from grinding wheels and steel screamed under pressure, there was a quieter sound that ruled the north. The soft, rhythmic scrape of metal against stone. Slow. Deliberate. Almost reverent. And in that sound lived a secret powerful enough to decide who lived and who bled out on frozen ground. Most people think Vikings trusted brute force. That they believed strength alone won battles. That their blades were crude, their methods primitive, their victories born from savagery rather than skill. But that belief was forged by those who never stood across from them. Those who never heard a blade sing after it had been awakened by river stone. Because a Viking blade was never truly sharp when it left the forge. It was unfinished. The forge gave it shape. Fire gave it hardness. But sharpness, true sharpness, was given by water, stone, and a patience most men did not possess. On the edge of the north, where pine forests leaned toward cold rivers and winter lingered longer than memory, there was a settlement that did not appear on maps. Not because it was hidden, but because no one who found it ever spoke of it again. The warriors there fought like ghosts. Their blades cut cleaner, deeper, quieter. Armor split. Shields failed. And wounds strangely did not bleed at first. They simply opened. Enemies blamed curses. Some whispered of magic. Others claimed the steel was forged from fallen stars. But the truth was far more unsettling. The secret lay in the river. That river did not roar. It did not rage. It moved with a calm that felt intentional, as if it knew exactly where it was going and had no fear of time. Its stones were smooth, pale, and cold to the touch even in summer. They had traveled farther than any ship, endured pressure greater than any hammer, and remembered things no living man could. And the Vikings listened to them. In that settlement lived a blacksmith named Eirik Skarstein. He was not large. He was not loud. His arms were scarred, his beard threaded with gray long before his time. But when warriors spoke his name, they lowered their voices not out of fear, but respect. Eirik did not simply make weapons. He finished them. Every blade that passed through his hands was carried to the river before it was ever lifted in battle. Not as a ritual. Not as superstition. As necessity. Eirik believed something most men found uncomfortable, that steel was not dead. He believed it remembered heat. Remembered blows. Remembered mistakes. And if you treated it with impatience, it would betray you when you needed it most. On the morning the story truly begins, the river was wrapped in mist so thick it swallowed sound. Eirik stood at its edge with his son, Leif, who was old enough now to ask questions and young enough to ask the wrong ones. Leif watched as his father knelt, selecting stones not by size or shape, but by feel. He passed dozens without pause, then stopped suddenly, fingers lingering on one half buried beneath the current. "This one," Eirik said softly. Leif frowned. "It looks like all the others." Eirik smiled, but did not look at him. "That is because you are looking with your eyes." He lifted the stone from the water. It was unremarkable. Smooth. Dull. Silent. Yet Eirik cradled it as if it could hear. "Every stone has a story," he continued. "Most are loud. This one has learned when to be quiet." Leif did not understand. Not yet. Eirik drew a blade from its leather wrap. It was newly forged. Perfectly straight. Strong. And dangerously dull in the way only unfinished weapons are, sharp enough to deceive, weak enough to fail. He placed the stone against the edge. And waited. The pause unsettled Leif more than the sharpening itself. No movement. No pressure. Just stillness. Then slowly the blade moved. Not fast. Never fast. Each stroke followed the river's rhythm. Each pass was identical to the last. No sparks. No force. Just consistency. Minutes passed. Then more. The mist shifted. The world narrowed to sound and motion. This is where men fail, Eirik said without stopping. They rush. They think sharpness is taken. It is not. It is earned. Leaf shifted impatiently. But others use wheels. Faster stones. They say it's the same. Eirik's hands never faltered. They say many things. That does not make them true. He lifted the blade and turned it slightly. A thin line of light danced along the edge, clean, unbroken, almost unnatural. This blade will not scream when it cuts, Eirik said. It will whisper. Leif felt something cold settle in his chest. Because he had seen screaming blades before. He had heard the tearing sound of metal fighting bone. He had seen men die loudly. He had never imagined death arriving quietly. Eirik returned the stone to the river, exactly where he had found it. Stones like this choose when they are finished, he said. You never take them for yourself. You borrow their time. That was the first lesson. And it would not be the last. Because word was spreading. Of battles decided in moments. Of shields split cleanly in half. Of warriors who fell without understanding why. And when secrets like this exist, the world does not leave them alone for long. By the end of that winter, strangers would arrive at the riverbank. Some seeking knowledge. Some seeking power. And some willing to burn the settlement to the ground to steal what the stones had taught. But none of them yet understood the truth. That the river did not give its secret freely. And every blade sharpened in its waters demanded a price. A price paid not in blood alone but in patience, silence, and the slow erosion of certainty itself. Winter came early that year, not with the drama of sudden storms, but with the slow tightening of the world. The river's voice grew lower, heavier, as if it were retreating inward. Ice crept along its edges like a deliberate thought, careful not to rush. Eirik noticed it before anyone else did. He always did. Sharpness, he believed, announced itself long before it was visible. The settlement carried on as it always had, wood smoke rising straight into pale skies, axes biting into frozen timber, children learning the weight of tools before they learned the weight of weapons. But beneath the surface of ordinary days, something had shifted. The blades returning from patrol were different now. Not chipped. Not damaged. Simply, altered. Warriors said they felt lighter in the hand. Quieter. As if they were cutting through the air before they ever touched flesh. Leif noticed it too. He watched men test their edges on hanging leather, expecting resistance, and flinch when the blade passed through without sound. He saw seasoned fighters stare at their own hands afterward, unsettled not by fear of enemies, but by fear of what they themselves now carried. And fear, once born, never stays contained. It traveled with traders who stopped briefly and left quickly. It slipped into half-spoken conversations at distant hearths. It reached ears that had no patience for whispers, only for advantage. Eirik felt it the night the ravens gathered. They perched along the riverbank in numbers that felt wrong, their black shapes stark against the snow. Ravens were never unwelcome in the north. But these did not watch. They waited. Silent. Still. As if expecting something to arrive. Leif stood beside his father, breath clouding the air. They know, he said. Eirik did not ask who. He did not need to. Yes, he replied. They always do. That night, for the first time, Eirik did not sleep beside the forge. He sat awake near the river, listening to the ice shift and sigh. In its movement he heard warning, not loud, not urgent, but insistent. Like a blade telling you it is about to fail long before it breaks. When dawn came, it brought strangers. They arrived without banners. Without songs. 3 ships pulled low into the shallows, their hulls scarred, their crews quiet. Men stepped onto the frost-hardened ground wearing armor that had seen too many repairs. These were not raiders. Raiders announced themselves. These men measured. Their leader was tall, narrow-eyed, his beard braided with metal rings taken from places that no longer existed. He introduced himself as Halder of the Eastern Fjords, though Eirik doubted that was the name he was born with. "I've come for your stones," Halder said plainly. The settlement did not move. Silence pressed down hard, brittle as ice. "There are no stones here," Eirik answered. Halder smiled. "There are always stones. Only fools pretend otherwise." He gestured, and one of his men stepped forward, drawing a sword. The blade caught the light and for a moment, Leif's breath stopped. It was sharp. Very sharp. Sharpened fast. Aggressively. The kind of edge that bit eagerly and dulled just as quickly. Halder dragged the blade across a piece of wood. It tore, fibers screaming. "Good steel," Halder said. "But I've seen better. I've felt better. Blades that don't argue with what they cut." His eyes locked onto Eirik. "Yours." Eirik did not deny it. Denial was for men who feared losing something. He feared something else entirely. "You want the stones," Eirik said. "But you do not understand them." "I don't need to," Halder replied. "I only need the result." That was when Eirik finally looked afraid not of violence, but of inevitability. "You cannot take what the river does not give," he said. Halder's smile thinned. "Rivers give to those strong enough to take." Before anyone could stop him, Halder's men rushed the bank. They tore stones from the shallows, filling sacks with anything smooth, anything pale. The ravens erupted into the air, their cries sharp and sudden. Eirik shouted for them to stop. Not because the stones would be missed but because something else had just been set in motion. That night, Halder's men sharpened their blades by firelight. They worked quickly, greedily, grinding edges with pressure and speed. Sparks flew. Steel screamed. The stones dulled beneath their hands, stripped of patience, stripped of time. Leif watched from the shadows, heart pounding. "They're doing it wrong," he whispered. Eirik closed his eyes. "No," he said softly. "They're doing it their way." When morning came, Halder was eager to test his prize. He chose a tree near the river bank. Thick. Old. Frozen solid. He swung once. The blade bit deep, too deep. The sound was wrong. The sword caught, twisted, and snapped near the hilt with a crack that echoed across the water. Halder staggered back, staring at the broken steel in disbelief. Blood trickled from his hand where the jagged edge had turned against him. Around him, similar sounds followed. Blades chipped. Edges rolled. One sword shattered entirely, fragments scattering across the snow. The river remained silent. Halder's expression hardened not with shame, but fury. "You cursed them," he snarled at Eirik. Eirik shook his head. "No," he said. "You did." That was the moment violence became inevitable. Because men who believe knowledge is stolen do not retreat when proven wrong. They burn. By nightfall, the settlement was under threat not from superior steel, but from wounded pride sharpened into rage. Fires were lit. Threats were shouted. And Leif realized, with a chill deeper than winter, that the river stones were no longer the danger. The danger was what men did when patience was denied. And the river? The river was still listening. Fire is never quiet in the north. Even before flames touch wood, they announce themselves through hurried footsteps, raised voices, the sharp crack of torches being lit with intent rather than warmth. That night, the settlement did not sleep. It listened. And in listening, it understood that this was no longer about stones or steel. It was about control. Halder did not order an attack. He didn't need to. His men moved with the restless energy of those who had already decided the ending of a story and now wanted the world to hurry toward it. They ringed the outer huts, torches low, waiting for fear to do what blades could not. But fear did not come. Instead, the settlement did something unexpected. They withdrew. Doors were barred. Fires were dampened. No challenges were shouted. No weapons were raised. It was as if the place had emptied itself of resistance. To men like Halder, this was confirmation, not caution. Leif felt the weight of it in his chest. "They think we're hiding," he whispered. Eirik tightened the leather strap around his cloak. "No," he said. "They think we're finished." They moved before dawn, slipping through paths known only to those who had walked them since childhood. The riverbank disappeared behind frost-laced trees as Eirik led his son higher, deeper, away from the forge, away from the familiar comfort of shaped iron and known heat. Leif wanted to ask questions. He wanted answers. But something in his father's silence told him this moment was not for understanding, it was for remembering. They reached a narrow bend where the river slowed unnaturally, even in winter. Ice avoided it. Stones lay exposed here that never showed themselves elsewhere, as if the water guarded them from curious hands. Eirik knelt. "This place," he said quietly, "is why the secret survived." Leif stared. "We're leaving the settlement. For now. And the others? They know where to go." Eirik reached into the water without hesitation. The cold should have burned. It didn't. He drew out a stone unlike the others, longer, darker, faintly veined, as if something beneath its surface had once moved. "This is not a sharpening stone," Eirik said. "This is a teaching stone." Leif swallowed. "You never showed this to anyone." Eirik met his eyes. "Because teaching requires loss." Before Leif could ask what that meant, the river spoke. Not with sound but with movement. The current shifted suddenly, rolling ice inward, grinding it against the banks. A low groan rose from beneath the surface, the sound of pressure redistributing itself. Eirik's grip tightened on the stone. "They took too much," he murmured. Back at the settlement, Halder's men grew impatient. When torches were finally thrown, flames climbed eagerly only to falter. Green wood smoked. Wet beams refused to catch. Wind turned erratic, pushing fire back toward those who carried it. Then the first scream came. A man stumbled from the shadows, clutching his leg. Not from a blade. From ice. The ground beneath him had collapsed without warning, swallowing his foot into freezing water. Others rushed to help and slipped. Panic spread faster than fire ever could. Halder shouted orders, but the river no longer listened to him. It surged. Water broke free of its banks in narrow channels, flooding low ground, extinguishing flames with brutal efficiency. Stones shifted beneath the surface, turning solid paths into traps. Men fell. Weapons were dropped. The settlement did not attack. It didn't need to. By the time Eirik and Leif returned, dawn was bleeding pale light into the sky. Halder's ships were gone, pushed off in haste, leaving behind broken blades, soaked armor, and something far more dangerous. Questions. The warriors of the settlement gathered quietly, eyes drawn not to the river but to Leif. Because he was holding the stone. Eirik placed a hand on his son's shoulder. The secret was never the stone, he said to them all. It was knowing when not to use it. Leif felt the weight of every gaze. "And now?" someone asked. Eirik looked toward the river, where the current had already begun to calm, as if nothing had happened. "Now the secret changes," he said. "Because it has been seen." Leif understood then. The river did not punish theft. It punished impatience. And the next time strangers came and it would not be enough to hide. It would not be enough to endure. The secret would have to be carried. And Leif. Leaf would have to become more than a blacksmith's son. Because some blades are not sharpened for battle. They are sharpened for inheritance. The river returned to its old voice within days, as if it were ashamed of having raised itself at all. I sealed over the scars it had made. Stones settled back into familiar places. To an outsider, nothing had changed. But the settlement felt it. Something fragile had been crossed, an invisible line drawn not in the earth, but in memory. The kind that does not heal simply because time moves forward. Men spoke less. Blades were wrapped more carefully. Even the children sensed it, lowering their voices near the river as if it could hear them thinking. Leaf slept poorly. He dreamed of stones grinding endlessly against one another, not in water, but in darkness. He dreamed of blades cutting without hands to guide them. He dreamed of his father standing at the river bank alone, waiting for something that never arrived. On the third night, Eirik woke him before dawn. "Come," he said. No explanation. No questions. They walked until the sky lightened, following a path that climbed away from the river into a stand of old pines. Snow muffled their steps. The air smelled of resin and cold iron. At the edge of the forest, half buried beneath drifted earth and moss, stood a structure Leaf had only seen once before. The old Sharpening Hall. It had not been used since Leaf was a child. No fires burned here. No tools lay out in the open. The door creaked as Eirik pushed it open, the sound echoing louder than it should have. Inside, the world felt narrower. Stone walls curved inward, guiding sound, trapping heat. The floor was worn smooth by centuries of careful movement. At the center of the room stood a shallow basin, empty, dry, waiting. Eirik closed the door behind them. "This place was built before the settlement," he said. "Before my father. Before his." Leaf's throat tightened. "Why bring me here now?" Eirik removed his cloak. Beneath it, wrapped in dark leather, was a blade Leaf had never seen. It was not ornate. No runes. No decoration. Its edge looked almost unfinished. But when Eirik held it, the air around it seemed attentive. "This blade has never tasted blood," Eirik said. "And yet it has ended more lives than any sword I've ever made." Leaf stared. "How?" "By deciding when not to cut." Eirik knelt and placed the blade across the empty basin. Then he did something Leaf had never seen him do. He stepped back. "You will sharpen it," Eirik said. Leaf's heart pounded. "I don't know how." "That," Eirik replied, "is the point." From a shelf along the wall, he lifted 3 stones and placed them before Leaf. One was pale and smooth. One dark and rough. One long and vain, the teaching stone. "Choose," Eirik said. Leaf hesitated. The pale stone felt familiar. Safe. The rough stone promised speed. But his eyes kept returning to the third. He reached for it. Eirik nodded once. Leaf placed the stone against the blade. He remembered the river's rhythm. The waiting. The silence before movement. He inhaled and began. The first strokes were wrong. Too fast. Too uneven. The stone resisted, scraping harshly. Leaf's hands tensed. "Slow," Eirik said. Leaf slowed. Minutes passed. Then more. His arms ached. His mind wandered. The urge to hurry clawed at him. But gradually, the sound changed. The scrape softened. The blade seemed to settle, as if accepting what was happening to it. Leaf felt it before he saw it. The edge caught the light not sharply, but evenly. Calmly. Eirik approached and ran a thumb near the edge, never touching. He smiled, not with pride, but relief. "Now you understand," he said. Leaf swallowed. "I understand that it takes time." Eirik shook his head. "No. You understand that you must change before the blade does." The door creaked. They turned. An elder stood in the threshold, face pale. "They're coming again," he said. "Not Halder." Eirik closed his eyes. "How many?" "Enough." Leif felt the weight of the blade in his hands shift, not heavier, but more present. "Then it's decided," Eirik said quietly. "The secret will not stay here." He looked at Leif. "And neither will you." Leif's breath caught. "You're sending me away." "I'm sending the knowledge forward." Outside, the wind rose. Snow fell harder. Somewhere far beyond the trees, ships cut through cold water, carrying men who had learned just enough to be dangerous. And this time, the river would not be enough. They left before sunrise, when even the birds were unsure whether the day had truly begun. The settlement did not gather to say farewell. There were no embraces, no spoken promises. Goodbyes, in the north, were heavy things. They invited hesitation. And hesitation was something Eirik refused to give his son. Leif carried only what he could not replace: the blade, wrapped carefully, the teaching stone, bound in cloth, and the memory of the river's rhythm, repeated in his mind like a pulse. Eirik walked with him as far as the old ridge, where the land dipped and the river vanished from sight. Frost coated his beard. His steps were slower than Leif remembered, though his posture remained unbroken. "You will be hunted," Eirik said, not unkindly. "Not because they know what you carry, but because they will sense what they lack." Leif nodded. He had felt that hunger before in Halder's eyes, in the way men rushed the stone instead of listening to it. "What if I fail?" Leif asked. Eirik stopped walking. Failure, in his father's teachings, was never spoken of lightly. "You will," Eirik said. "Many times." Leif looked up, startled. "And each time," Eirik continued, "you will decide whether to hurry or to wait. That choice is the secret. Not the stone. Not the blade." He placed a hand on Leif's chest. "Wherever you go, remember this: steel does not betray you. Men betray themselves." They stood in silence. Then Eirik stepped back. "Go." Leif turned away before doubt could root itself. He walked until the trees swallowed him, until the sounds of home faded into the hiss of snow underfoot. He did not look back. Behind him, the settlement prepared. Those who remained did not sharpen blades. They dulled them. They understood what was coming was not a battle to be won but a delay to be endured. They would buy time. Time for Leif to disappear. Time for the secret to move beyond reach. When the ships arrived, they came with confidence. Different banners. Different accents. But the same eyes. They demanded stones. They demanded blades. When refused, they attacked. This time, the river stayed silent. No surge. No collapse. No warning. Men fought. Wood burned. Steel rang. The settlement paid its price not because the river had failed them but because the secret had already left. Far away, Leif felt it. A tightness in his chest. A wrongness in the air. He stopped walking, hand pressed against the wrapped blade as if it could answer him. He understood then what Eirik had meant. Knowledge survives by moving. Homes do not. Leif traveled north, then east, avoiding roads, avoiding names. He stayed with people who asked few questions and left before they could ask more. When blades were offered for sharpening, he refused most. "You work too slowly," one man scoffed. Leif nodded. "Then you do not need me." But sometimes, rarely, he sensed patience. An old hunter with a cracked bow. A woman whose knife had been her mother's. A guard who had seen too many blades fail at the wrong moment. For them, Leif worked. He taught nothing. He showed nothing. He sharpened in silence. And they noticed. They noticed how their blades cut cleaner. How they held their edge longer. How they trusted them without knowing why. Rumors spread again. They always did. But this time, they had no river to follow. No settlement to burn. Only a name that kept changing. A man who carried a stone and waited longer than made sense. Years passed. Leaf aged. And one winter, as he knelt beside a narrow stream far from the north, a boy stood watching him. The boy was restless. Curious. Impatient. "Why don't you sharpen faster?" the boy asked. Leaf smiled. Because the question told him everything he needed to know. He placed the stone down. And waited.